The corset laces snapped like bones breaking. Thaddeus Blackwell froze his hands halfway to the silk ties as his new wife's
What
bare back
happened
was
to you?
revealed in the amber
Don't
glow of a
touch it!
single
We
candle.
need to talk
The
about
wedding
this.
dress pooled
No,
at her
please.
waist, heavy Belgian
Release
lace
her
worth
hand,
more than
sir.
a farmhand
She is
earned in
not
5
yours to
years.
claim.
Please,
But
stop this
Thaddeus
at
wasn't
once!
looking at the
No,
dress.
Amanda!
He was looking at the war zone carved into Isolde Vance's skin. Not the smooth porcelain canvas of a pampered heiress. A
Dearly
battlefield.
beloved, we are gathered
Thick
here
ridges
today
of
to
scar
join
tissue
this man and this
crisscrossed
woman
from her
in holy
shoulder blades
matrimony.
down
I
to
do.
the curve
I
of her
do.
spine. Some faded to silvery white, others angry pink, raw enough that they might still bleed if touched. Near her left shoulder blade, 3 circular burns branded her flesh like cattle marks. One wound at the base of her neck was scabbed over weeping clear fluid. The breath left Thaddeus's lungs in a sharp hiss. Isolde's body went rigid. She hunched her shoulders forward, arms crossing over her bare chest, waiting for the blow, waiting for the disgust, waiting for the door to slam and the carriage wheels to crunch gravel as he sent her back to hell. "Don't," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the December wind rattling the windows of Blackwell Manor. "Please, don't send me back to the cellar. I'll be silent, invisible. I'll never speak. Just please not back to Riverside." Riverside Sanitarium. The name hung in the cold air between them like a curse. Thaddeus had heard of it. Every man of his station had. A private asylum on an island in the Hudson River where wealthy families sent their inconvenient women. Wives who drank, daughters who refused arranged marriages, sisters who asked too many questions about inheritance. They went in quietly and they came out broken. If they came out at all. He stepped back, not from revulsion, but from the sudden, violent rage igniting in his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt since the war, since Antietam, since he'd seen what men could do to each other when they believed God was on their side. "Who did this to you?" His voice came out low, dangerous. The same tone he'd used when interrogating Confederate spies in Virginia when a wrong answer meant a noose. Isolde flinched at the sound. Her knees buckled slightly, legs hitting the edge of the 4-poster bed. She looked like a woman expecting a firing squad. "It was necessary," she recited the words mechanical, rehearsed. "For my discipline, for my wickedness, I was possessed by spirits of defiance. The treatments were God's mercy." Uncle Cornelius said, "Your uncle did this." "No." A bitter, hysterical laugh escaped her throat. "Uncle Cornelius paid others to do it. Dr. Mordaunt, Matron Howell, the orderlies whose names I never learned. And sometimes," her voice cracked, "sometimes Garrett, your cousin." She nodded, still facing away from him, still trembling. Thaddeus walked around the bed to face her. Isolde tried to shrink back, but there was nowhere to go. She stood there, arms wrapped around herself, tears streaming down her face, violet eyes fixed on the Persian rug beneath her bare feet. "Look at me." She shook her head. "Isolde, look at me." Slowly, as if lifting a great weight, she raised her chin. Her eyes met his, not the vapid gaze of a sheltered debutante he'd expected at their wedding ceremony 6 hours ago. These were the eyes of a soldier who'd survived a siege, wary, exhausted, waiting for the next artillery shell. Thaddeus reached for the silk robe draped over the bedpost and wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling it closed at her throat. His hands were steady, deliberate. He tied the sash with care. "You will not be sleeping in this bed tonight," he said. Isolde's face crumpled. "I understand. I'm damaged goods. Too ugly. I'll sleep on the floor. I won't trouble you." "No." Thaddeus's voice cut through her spiral like a blade. He caught her chin between his thumb and forefinger, forcing her to meet his eyes again. "You misunderstand me. You will sleep in this bed. Alone. I'll take the chaise in the dressing room." She blinked. Confusion washed over her features, displacing the terror for just a moment. But the marriage, the duty. To hell with the duty. Thaddeus released her and walked to the window, staring out at the frost-silvered grounds of his Connecticut estate. The Hudson River glittered beyond the winter-bare trees like a ribbon of black ice. "And to hell with your uncle." He turned back to face her. In the candlelight, his eyes gray as a storm over the Atlantic, held something Isolde had never seen directed at her before. Not pity, not lust, something harder, colder, fury. From this moment forward, Thaddeus said each word precise as a rifle shot, "No one touches you, not a doctor, not a priest, and certainly not Cornelius Vance. Do you understand?" Isolde stared at him. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She'd expected a monster. She'd expected to be used like livestock and discarded. She'd expected another 3 years of darkness, just in a different cage. She didn't know what to make of this angry stranger who looked at her scars and saw injustice instead of shame. Why, the word came out as a whisper. Thaddeus looked at the candle flame dancing on the bedside table. His jaw worked. When he spoke again, his voice was rougher edged with something raw. Because I may be a cold bastard, Isolde. I married you for 50,000 acres of Maine timberland. I didn't marry you for love, but I'm not a monster. And I don't tolerate the abuse of what's mine. He walked to the mahogany desk in the corner and unlocked the bottom drawer. When he straightened, he held two items, a Colt Navy revolver, the blued steel gleaming, and a thick leather portfolio bound with red ribbon. Isolde's eyes went to the gun first. This, Thaddeus said, setting the revolver on the desk with a heavy thunk, is for emergencies. 6 rounds, point and pull the trigger. Later, I'll teach you to aim. He held up the portfolio. This is your father's will, the real one. Isolde's breath caught. I don't understand. Uncle Cornelius said, your uncle lied. Thaddeus untied the ribbon and spread the documents across the desk. I had my investigators retrieve this from the New York County Clerk's office 3 weeks before our wedding. Your father, Jonathan Vance, was a meticulous man. He filed 3 copies of his last will and testament. Your uncle destroyed 2. He didn't know about the 3rd. He gestured for her to approach. Isolde moved slowly, the silk robe rustling her bare feet, silent on the carpet. She looked down at the yellowed parchment, at her father's familiar handwriting. Bold, decisive strokes she remembered from birthday cards and letters when he traveled for business. I, Jonathan Vance, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my entire estate to my beloved daughter, Isolde Catherine Vance, upon her 21st birthday or marriage, whichever comes first. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. The estate, Thaddeus continued, his finger tracing down the itemized list, included 2 steel mills in Pittsburgh, a shipping fleet operating out of Boston Harbor, 3 brownstone properties in Manhattan, government bonds worth $500,000, and $4 million in liquid assets held by Merchants Bank. $4 million, the number was incomprehensible. Isolde had owned nothing for 3 years. No possessions, no privacy, not even her own hair. They'd shaved it on the first night at Riverside to purify her. Your uncle was granted a stipend, Thaddeus said, $500 annually, nothing more. But he told me, Isolde's voice broke. He said father was ashamed of me, that father knew I was defective. That's why he left everything to Uncle Cornelius to protect the family legacy from my madness. Your father left you everything because he loved you. Thaddeus's voice gentled just slightly. But there was a clause, the sanity clause. He flipped to the 3rd page and pointed. In the event that the primary heir is deemed mentally incompetent or is institutionalized for a period exceeding 2 years, stewardship of the estate shall pass to the nearest male relative of sound mind. The room tilted. Isolde gripped the edge of the desk to keep from falling. That's why, she breathed. That's why he sent me to Riverside immediately, 3 days after the funeral. Yes, it wasn't about God or spirits or my immortal soul. No, it was about $4 million. Thaddeus nodded. He watched her face carefully, cataloging the emotions flickering across it: shock, grief, rage, understanding. She was stronger than she looked, this scarred ghost in a silk robe. Her hands were shaking, but her spine was straightening. The hunted animal look was fading from her eyes, replaced by something sharper. He killed them, Isolde said suddenly. My father. Mother died when I was 12, but father, they said it was his heart. He was only 45. Healthy, rode horses, never even had indigestion. My investigators found the attending physician, Thaddeus said quietly, Dr. Bernard Hastings. He died 6 months after your father, but his personal journal survived. He noted that your father's symptoms, the sudden paralysis, the irregular heartbeat, the blue lips, were consistent with digitalis poisoning. Digitalis, foxglove, a common garden plant. In small doses, it strengthens the heart. In larger doses, it stops it. Thaddeus inclined his head. Isolde sank into the leather chair beside the desk. She stared at her hands, small, pale, the nails bitten down to the quick. These hands had signed away nothing at Riverside, no matter how much they'd hurt her. She'd refused again and again until they stopped asking and started punishing. Why are you telling me this? She asked, looking up at Thaddeus. You married me for the timberland. You have what you wanted. Why show me this? Why arm me? Thaddeus poured 2 glasses of bourbon from the crystal decanter on his desk. He pressed one into her hand and kept the other for himself. Because I spent 4 years in the war, he said, leaning against the desk, his tall frame casting long shadows in the candlelight. 1861 to 1865. I was a major in the Union Army, but not regular infantry, military intelligence. My job was to find Confederate spies, turn them or eliminate them, and feed false information back through their networks. He took a long drink. I got very good at recognizing liars, Isolde. And your Uncle Cornelius is the worst kind. The kind who believes his own lies. The kind who sleeps soundly after signing the death warrant for his own brother. How did you know, Isolde whispered, about the scars, about Riverside? Cornelius told everyone I was at a finishing school in Switzerland. I didn't know about the scars. Thaddeus's jaw tightened. But I don't marry blind. When your uncle approached me 6 months ago with the offer your hand in exchange for the Maine timberland land, I had my investigators look into you. I've been investigating your family for months. They found inconsistencies. Letters from Zurich that were postmarked from New York. A trail of payments to Riverside Sanitarium. Bribes to judges. Forged medical certificates. He set down his glass. I married you knowing you'd been imprisoned. I didn't know they'd tortured you. If I had. He stopped, his hand curled into a fist on the desktop. Isolde found herself believing him. This cold, precise man who spoke of murder and espionage, with the same detached tone he might use to discuss railroad stocks, he was genuinely angry on her behalf. It was almost harder to process than the scars. What happens now, she asked. Thaddeus straightened. He walked to the window again, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the frozen landscape. Tomorrow morning, he said, you're going to write down every name. Everyone who worked at Riverside, everyone who touched you. Dr. Mordaunt, Matron Howell, the orderlies, and your cousin Garrett. And then we're going to destroy them. He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made her shiver, not from fear, but from something else. Something that felt almost like hope. Not with guns. That's too quick, too clean. We're going to use the law. We're going to use their greed against them. We're going to make them tear each other apart. How? A thin smile crossed Thaddeus's face. It wasn't a kind expression. Your uncle thinks he's safe. He thinks you're broken, silent, obedient. He thinks this marriage makes you my problem now, and he can wash his hands of you while keeping your fortune. He's wrong on every count. Thaddeus crossed to the desk and pulled out a sheet of heavy parchment and a fountain pen. He began writing in a clear, firm hand. Tomorrow night we're attending the opera. Metropolitan Opera House. Your uncle will be there with Garrett. They go every Saturday. It's a social obligation for men of their station. Isolde's chest tightened. I can't see them. Not yet. Yes, you can. Thaddeus didn't look up from his writing. Because you won't be facing them alone. You'll be on my arm. You'll be wearing the Blackwell Sapphire's jewels that haven't been worn in public since my mother died. Jewels worth more than your uncle's entire estate. And you'll look Garrett in the eye and you'll smile. I don't understand. Because you're not his victim anymore, Isolde. Thaddeus set down the pen and looked at her directly. You're my wife. You're the richest woman in Connecticut. You're the heir to a steel fortune, and I want your uncle and cousin to really see that their property has been stolen from them. He paused, and that she's not coming back. Isolde stood slowly, the bourbon burned in her empty stomach, spreading warmth through her chest. She looked at this stranger she'd married, this ice king of Connecticut society, this railroad baron who moved through the world with the cold efficiency of a clockwork mechanism. I can't, she said again, but her voice was steadier now. I'm not strong enough. I'm broken. Then borrow my strength. Thaddeus crossed the room in 3 long strides. He didn't touch her, but he stood close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. I have enough for both of us. But Isolde, listen to me. This only works if you fight with me, not behind me. I need you to be brave. Just for one night, can you do that if Wisham? Could she 3 years in the cellar? 3 years of ice baths and leather straps and Garrett's face at the observation window, watching her drown. 3 years of Dr. Mordaunt's calm voice explaining that the pain was God's will, that her suffering was purification, that her screams were demons being driven out. She'd survive that. Surely she could survive one night at the opera. Yes, Isolde whispered. Good. Thaddeus stepped back. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we begin. He walked toward the dressing room but paused at the door. One more thing. That revolver on the desk. Keep it close. Your uncle won't take this quietly. When he realizes what we're doing, he'll come for you. And when he does us, I'll shoot him. No. Thaddeus's smile was grim. You'll make him wish you had. The morning sun brought no warmth to Blackwell Manor. It only illuminated the dust motes dancing in the high-ceilinged rooms and cast long shadows across the Persian carpets. Isolde woke alone in the enormous 4-poster bed tangled in silk sheets, her body aching as if she'd fought a battle in her sleep. Perhaps she had. She dressed herself in the gown the maid had laid out, a high-necked dress of dark blue velvet that covered every inch of skin from chin to wrist to ankle. The fabric was soft, expensive. Nothing like the rough gray shift they'd made her wear at Riverside. But it felt like armor, all the same. Henderson the butler appeared at her door. "His Grace requests your presence in the study, ma'am." His Grace, the title still felt foreign. Thaddeus Blackwell wasn't actually a duke that was British nonsense, but Connecticut society had dubbed him the Ice King, and servants defaulted to aristocratic forms of address when they didn't know what else to call a man who owned half the state's railroad lines. Isolde followed Henderson through the manor. It was the first time she'd seen the house in daylight. Dark wood paneling, oil paintings of severe-looking ancestors, a grand staircase that curved up to the second floor like a frozen waterfall. Everything was precisely ordered, meticulously maintained, and utterly devoid of warmth. It reminded her of Thaddeus himself. The study door was open. Isolde entered to find her husband exactly where she'd left him the night before, behind the massive mahogany desk, surrounded by files and ledgers, a half-empty glass of bourbon at his elbow. He hadn't changed clothes. His white shirt was rumpled collar, open sleeves rolled to his elbows. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. He hadn't slept. "Sit," Thaddeus said without preamble, gesturing to the leather chair across from him. Isolde sat, her hands folded automatically in her lap, a habit from Riverside where any movement could be construed as aggression and punished accordingly. Thaddeus slid a blank sheet of paper and a pen across the desk. "I need names. Everyone at Riverside who hurt you. Start with the staff, then the administrators, then anyone else who was complicit. Take your time. Be thorough." Isolde stared at the blank page. Her hand trembled as she picked up the pen. "Dr. Silas Mordaunt," she said aloud as she wrote. "Medical director. He believed in hydrotherapy, ice baths, 4 hours at a time, and correctional framing." "What's correctional framing?" Her pen stilled. "They strap you to a table, face down, and then," she swallowed hard, "then they use a cane. Systematically. Dr. Mordaunt said it was to drive out the demons of defiance." Thaddeus's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "Next name?" "Matron Gertrude Howell. She supervised the treatments. Isolde's breath hitched. She enjoyed it, the cane work. She smiled while she did it. The pen scratched across the paper. Thaddeus wrote the name in his own ledger, adding notes in a small, precise hand. "Anyone else?" "The orderlies. There were 4 of them, but I never learned their names. They rotated shifts. Big men. They held me down during the ice baths when I fought too hard." Physical descriptions. Isolde closed her eyes, forcing herself back into the memory. One had a scar, here. She touched her left cheek. Another was missing 2 fingers on his right hand. The third had red hair. The fourth was... Her voice cracked. The fourth was the one Garrett always requested. Thaddeus set down his pen. "Tell me about Garrett." The name tasted like ash in her mouth. "My cousin," she said quietly. "He's 28, Uncle Cornelius's son. He never worked, never had to. The family money, my father's money, kept him in tailored suits and opera boxes and mistresses in the city." "What did he do at Riverside?" Isolde's hands clenched in her lap. "He visited, every Sunday. Uncle Cornelius gave him special permission. Garrett would watch through the observation window during the ice bath treatments. Sometimes Dr. Mordaunt would let him participate. He'd hold me under the water until I stopped struggling, until everything went dark." She opened her eyes and looked at Thaddeus. "He said it was family therapy, that watching me suffer would teach him compassion, that participating would show him the consequences of female hysteria, so he'd choose a wife more carefully." The bourbon glass in Thaddeus's hand cracked. Not shattered, just a small fracture, spider-webbing across the crystal. He set it down carefully and flexed his fingers. "Is he in New York?" Thaddeus's voice was very quiet, very controlled. The same tone he'd used last night when he'd promised to burn her uncle's world to the ground. "Yes, he keeps an apartment on 5th Avenue. Uncle Cornelius mentioned yesterday at the wedding reception that Garrett would be attending the opera tonight. The Saturday performance is a social obligation." "Good." Thaddeus stood abruptly and walked to the window. "Then so is ours." Isolde watched him stare out at the frozen Hudson. His reflection in the glass looked carved from granite. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't face him. Not yet. When I close my eyes, I still see his face. I still hear him counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, seeing how long he could hold me under before I passed out." Thaddeus turned. "What's the longest you lasted?" The question caught her off guard. "What? Before you passed out?" What's the longest you held your breath while he tried to drown you? I, I don't know. 2 minutes, maybe more. That's extraordinary. Thaddeus crossed back to the desk. With soldiers in training can barely manage 90 seconds. You survived because you're stronger than you think. Stronger than he knows. He pulled a small leather case from his desk drawer and opened it. Inside, nestled in velvet, were 2 hairpins, delicate, ornate, tipped with tiny pearls. Do you know what these are? Isolde shook her head. Lock picks. Thaddeus removed one and held it up to the light. During the war, we taught our intelligence officers to open handcuffs, cell doors, desk drawers. Information is worthless if you can't access it. He handed her both pins. That door. He pointed to a side door in the study. It's locked. Open it. I don't know how. Then you'll learn. You have 2 hours until we need to prepare for the opera. Practice. Isolde stood on shaking legs. She approached the door and knelt, studying the old-fashioned lock. The keyhole was large enough to see through. She inserted the first hairpin, feeling blindly for the mechanism inside. Nothing happened. She tried again. And again. Her fingers cramped. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the winter chill. Behind her, she could hear Thaddeus working the scratch of his pen, the rustle of papers, the clink of his glass being refilled. He didn't help, didn't encourage, just waited. On her 7th attempt, something clicked. The lock turned. The door swung open. Isolde looked back at Thaddeus, breathless, disbelieving. He nodded once, again, but faster this time. She locked the door and tried again. This time it took 5 attempts, then 3, then 2. By the time Henderson knocked to announce that it was time to dress for the opera, Isolde could open the lock in under a minute. Her hands were steady. Thaddeus stood and buttoned his collar, transforming from the rumpled investigator into the Ice King of Connecticut society. Tonight, he said, when we arrive at the opera, your uncle and cousin will see you. They'll see the sapphires around your neck, jewels, worth more than their yearly income. They'll see you on my arm, poised and elegant. And they'll realize you're not the broken thing they discarded. He paused at the door. And then, when Garrett approaches you to assert his dominance, to remind you that you're still that girl in the cellar, you're going to look him in the eye. You're not going to flinch. You're not going to apologize. You're going to let him see that his victim has become something else entirely. What if I can't? Isolde's voice was small. Then imagine he's a lock, Thaddeus said, and pick him apart piece by piece until he opens. The Metropolitan Opera House blazed with gaslight and ambition. New York's wealthiest families arrived in gilded carriages, the women dripping in diamonds, the men in white tie and tails. It was opening night of the winter season La Traviata, and anyone who mattered would be in attendance. Thaddeus's carriage pulled up to the red carpet. A footman opened the door. Thaddeus stepped out first, his tall frame imposing in perfectly tailored evening wear. He turned and offered his hand to the darkness inside the carriage. Isolde placed her gloved hand in his and stepped down. The crowd outside the entrance fell silent. She wore midnight blue silk that shimmered like oil on water in the gaslight. The gown had been his mother's, altered by the manor seamstress in a matter of hours. High-necked, long-sleeved, it revealed nothing, and yet it transformed Isolde from the frightened ghost of last night into something else entirely. Around her neck sat the Blackwell sapphires. 7 stones each, the size of a robin's egg, set in platinum. They hadn't been worn in public since Thaddeus's mother died 15 years ago. Their value exceeded the annual income of most families in the audience combined. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Is that her, the silent lady? She looks different. Those are the Blackwell sapphires. I heard she was mad. Thaddeus offered Isolde his arm. She took it, her hand trembling only slightly. Together they ascended the grand staircase, every eye in the opera house tracking their progress. Chin up, Thaddeus murmured, quiet enough that only she could hear. You're above them. You're Isolde Blackwell, wife of the richest man in Connecticut. They're merely spectators. Isolde lifted her chin. The sapphires were heavy and cold against her throat, but somehow that weight was grounding. Armor. A reminder that she was no longer that girl in the gray shift shivering in the cellar. They reached their private box on the 2nd tier. Thaddeus held the curtain aside and Isolde entered the small, intimate space. Red velvet chairs, a perfect view of the stage, and directly across the horseshoe curve of the opera house, her breath stopped. In the box opposite, Cornelius Vance sat like a toad in evening wear, his round face flushed with too much wine. And beside him, laughing at something a woman in diamonds was saying, sat Garrett. Her cousin looked exactly as she remembered, handsome in a soft, dissolute way, blonde curls carefully styled, a mouth that smiled too easily. But his eyes, even from this distance, Isolde could see his eyes, flat, dead, like a shark's. Garrett hadn't noticed her yet. He was too busy playing the charming bachelor, too busy pretending to be a gentleman, instead of the monster who'd held her underwater and counted her drowning. Thaddeus guided Isolde to her seat. He sat beside her, apparently relaxed, one ankle crossed over his knee, but his hand rested on the chair arm between them, close enough that she could take it if she needed to. "He hasn't seen you yet," Thaddeus observed quietly. "I know. When he does, he's going to react. Probably come over during intermission to assert dominance, to remind you who you were." Isolde's hands clenched in her lap. "What do I do? Nothing." Thaddeus's voice was ice. "I'll handle it. Your only job is to not look away. Can you do that?" Before she could answer, Garrett's gaze swept across the opera house and landed on their box. His smile faltered, then widened into something uglier. Recognition, possession, the look of a man who'd found a toy he thought he'd lost. He raised his opera glasses, the brass glinting in the gaslight, brazenly staring, violating her with his eyes even from across the theater. It was a power move, a reminder. You're still mine, still that broken thing in the cellar, still don't look away, Thaddeus said softly. Isolde forced herself to hold Garrett's gaze, to stare back through the vast space between them, to funnel 3 years of suppressed rage and hatred into her eyes and project it outward like a weapon. You didn't break me, she thought with every fiber of her being. You tried, you failed, and now I'm going to make you pay. Garrett lowered his opera glasses. For just a moment, so brief that Isolde almost missed it, uncertainty flickered across his face. Then Cornelius noticed them. His florid face went pale, then red, then purple. He leaned close to Garrett, whispering urgently. Garrett's hand went to his pocket as if checking for something. The commitment papers, Isolde realized. They'd brought commitment papers to the opera, planning to have her dragged out, perhaps, back to Riverside, back to the dark. They're going to come over, she whispered. I know. Thaddeus didn't take his eyes off the Vance box. Let them. The lights dimmed, the orchestra began the overture, but Isolde couldn't focus on the music. Every nerve in her body was screaming. Every instinct honed by 3 years of survival was telling her to run, to hide, to make herself small and invisible. Instead, she sat up straight. She touched the sapphires at her throat. She kept her eyes on the stage, even though she couldn't hear the singers over the roaring in her ears. She waited. Intermission came like a guillotine blade falling. The house lights rose. The audience stood stretching, moving toward the refreshment rooms. And across the theater, Cornelius Vance stood. Garrett stood beside him. They were coming. Ready? Thaddeus asked. Isolde's throat was too dry to speak. She nodded. The knock on their box door came exactly 90 seconds later. The usher's voice, Mr. Cornelius Vance and Mr. Garrett Vance request entry. Thaddeus stood slowly, buttoning his jacket with deliberate precision. Let them in. The door opened. The air in the small box instantly became toxic. Cornelius Vance entered with false warmth plastered across his face, cologne and cigar smoke rolling off him in waves. Garrett sauntered in behind him, eyes immediately finding Isolde. Mr. Blackwell, Cornelius boomed, reaching for Thaddeus's hand. And my dear niece, you look recovered. Thaddeus ignored the offered handshake. His voice when he spoke could have frozen bourbon solid. She was never ill, merely mishandled. Cornelius's smile stiffened. Garrett stepped forward, that familiar predatory light in his eyes. Cousin Isolde, Garrett purred, the blue suits you. Though you always preferred gray, didn't you, that particular shade they use in the isolation wards? He reached for her hand, intending to raise it to his lips, a possessive gesture, a reminder of ownership, a violation disguised as courtesy. Isolde pulled back. It was a small movement, barely noticeable. But in that intimate space with Thaddeus watching like a hawk and Garrett's hand extended in empty air, it was a declaration of war. Garrett's smile curdled. Now, cousin, there's no need to be rude. We're family. Before he could reach for her again, Thaddeus's hand shot out. He caught Garrett's wrist mid-motion. His grip was iron, final. The crack of bone grinding against bone was audible only to the 4 people in the box. But Garrett's eyes went wide. His mouth opened in a silent scream of pain. You mistake your position, Mr. Vance. Thaddeus's voice was a low, terrifying purr. He didn't look at Garrett's hand. He looked him dead in the eye. You do not touch Mrs. Blackwell. You do not speak to Mrs. Blackwell unless she addresses you first. And if you ever look at her again with that presumptuous smirk, and I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your life regretting it. He released Garrett's wrist with a violent shove. Garrett stumbled back, cradling his hand against his chest. His face had gone white. Sweat beaded on his upper lip. The entire theater had gone quiet. Everyone in the boxes near them was staring. Fans had stopped fluttering. Conversations had died mid-word. All eyes were on the Blackwell box where the Ice King had just publicly brutalized a member of one of New York's oldest families. Cornelius sputtered. This is an outrage, Blackwell. My son was merely being polite. We're leaving. Thaddeus's announcement cut through Cornelius's protest like a scalpel. The air has become putrid. He offered Isolde his arm. She stood on trembling legs and took it. For the first time in 3 years, Isolde looked at her cousin without flinching. Garrett was clutching his wrist, whimpering. The smug predator was gone. In his place stood a weak, cruel boy who'd gotten exactly what he deserved. She felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Not happiness, not quite, but something close. Contempt. As they moved toward the door, Isolde paused beside her uncle. Cornelius was red-faced, furious, already reaching into his jacket pocket for the commitment papers he'd brought to drag her back to hell. Isolde looked him in the eye. Uncle, she said. Her voice was quiet but carried to every box nearby. Enjoy what's left of father's money while you still can. Then she walked out, her hand steady on Thaddeus's arm, the Blackwell sapphires blazing at her throat. Behind them she heard Cornelius's strangled curse. Garrett's pain breathing. The eruption of whispered scandals spreading through the opera house like wildfire. Let them talk, Isolde thought. Let them all talk. She'd spent 3 years silent, invisible, broken. Those days were over. The carriage ride back to Blackwell Manor was silent, but the quality of that silence had changed. No longer the suffocating quiet of fear. This was the silence of co-conspirators, of soldiers after their first victory breathing hard, adrenaline still coursing through their veins. Isolde sat across from Thaddeus in the dim interior, watching the gas lamps of New York slide past the window. Her hands had finally stopped shaking. The sapphires felt lighter around her neck, now less like a weight and more like a crown. You looked him in the eye, Thaddeus said. His voice held something that might have been approval. You didn't flinch. I wanted to. Isolde's fingers traced the velvet seat beside her. Every instinct I have told me to run, to apologize, to make myself small. But you didn't. No, she looked at him directly. I thought about what you said, about picking locks, about how sometimes the hardest part is just believing the mechanism will open if you apply the right pressure. Thaddeus's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close. And did he open? He cracked. Isolde felt that strange sensation in her chest again. The one that felt almost like power. Did you see his face when you grabbed his wrist? He was terrified. Good. Fear is useful. It makes people sloppy. The carriage hit a rut, jostling them both. Thaddeus steadied himself against the window frame, and for a moment his face was illuminated by passing streetlight. Isolde saw the dark circles under his eyes, the tension in his jaw. He'd been awake for 2 days straight, planning this. Planning her. Why are you doing this? The question escaped before she could stop it. You have the timberland. You have what you married me for. You could have just ignored what they did. Let Cornelius keep his money. Let me be the quiet wife in the corner. It would be easier. Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment. The carriage wheels clattered over cobblestones, the sound echoing off brownstone walls. My mother, he said finally. She died when I was 7. Officially, it was pneumonia. That's what the death certificate said. What everyone believed. He looked down at his hands. But I was 7, not blind. I saw the bruises she's tried to hide. I heard her crying through the walls when my father came home drunk. The night she died, I watched through the banister as he shoved her down the stairs. Watched her head hit the marble. Watched her stop moving. Isolde's breath caught. The doctors who came said pneumonia because my father paid them to say it. The police didn't investigate because he was Jonathan Blackwell, railroad magnate, pillar of the community. And I was a child. Who would believe me? His hands curled into fists on his knees. I swore 2 things that night. First, that I would never become him. And second, that I would never stand by while someone else did what he did. Not if I had the power to stop it. He looked up at Isolde, and his gray eyes held something raw. Something he usually kept locked behind that Ice King facade. When I saw your scars, I saw my mother's bruises. When you begged me not to send you back to the dark, I heard her begging him to stop. And I realized that this time, finally, I'm not 7 years old and powerless. This time I can actually do something. Isolde felt tears prick her eyes. Not from sadness, from recognition, from understanding that this cold, precise man wasn't cold at all. He was frozen. Locked down, holding himself so tightly controlled because If he ever let go, the rage inside him might consume everything. She reached across the carriage and placed her hand over his fist. "Thank you," she whispered. Thaddeus looked at her hand on his small, pale scar where the restraints had bitten into her wrists. He turned his palm up and closed his fingers around hers. "We're not done," he said quietly. "Tonight was just the opening move. Your uncle and Gertrude will retaliate. They have to. Their reputations are at stake now. Every gossip in New York society saw what happened. By tomorrow, the scandal will be in every drawing room from Fifth Avenue to Washington Square. What will they do? They'll try to have you committed again." Thaddeus's grip tightened slightly. "They'll claim you're unstable, that I'm being manipulated, that the scene at the opera proves you're dangerous. They'll get Dr. Mordaunt to sign medical certificates. They'll bribe a magistrate for commitment papers. And they'll come for you." Isolde's chest constricted. "When Iron? Soon. Tonight, possibly. Cornelius won't wait. He can't afford to." The carriage turned onto the long drive leading to Blackwell Manor. Through the window, Isolde could see the house rising against the night sky, dark stone, tall windows, forbidding as a fortress. "What do we do?" she asked. Thaddeus released her hand and straightened his collar, his face sliding back into that mask of cold control. "We let them come," he said, "and we make sure they regret it." The clock in Blackwell Manor's entrance hall struck 11 as they arrived home. Henderson met them at the door, taking Thaddeus's coat and hat with his usual efficiency. But there was something in the butler's face, a tightness around his eyes. "Sir," Henderson said quietly, "a package arrived from Mrs. Blackwell. I took the liberty of placing it in your study." Thaddeus and Isolde exchanged a glance. They moved together through the darkened hallways, their footsteps echoing on marble floors. The study door stood open, lamplight spilling out. On the desk sat a small wooden box wrapped in brown paper. No address, no postage mark, hand-delivered. Isolde stared at it. Her hands had started shaking again. "Don't open it," she whispered. "Please, whatever it is." But Thaddeus was already cutting the string with his letter opener. The brown paper fell away. The wooden box was plain, unvarnished. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of red velvet, lay a lock of blonde hair tied with a blue ribbon. Isolde's scream tore through the silent house. She stumbled backward, hands flying to her throat, to her own hair grown back now, but she could still remember the bite of the shears, the cold efficiency of Matron Howell shaving her head that first night at Riverside. To purify her, to strip away her vanity, to make her less than human. "It's mine," she choked out. "That's my hair. They cut it the first night. They kept it." Thaddeus's hand shot out, steadying her before she could fall. With his other hand, he lifted the lock of hair. Beneath it, folded neatly, was a note. He unfolded it, read it. His face went very still. "What does it say?" Isolde managed. Thaddeus's voice was flat when he read aloud. "The treatment is not yet complete. The patient has escaped, but the sickness remains. We are coming to collect her tonight. Signed, Dr. Silas Mordaunt, Medical Director, Riverside Sanitarium." The study seemed to tilt. Isolde gripped the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing. "He's coming. Tonight. He'll take me back." "No." Thaddeus set down the note with deliberate care. He walked to the fireplace and threw the lock of hair and the letter into the flames. They curled and blackened, turning to ash. "He's not taking you anywhere." He pulled the bell cord. Henderson appeared within seconds. "Send a telegram to Colonel Sterling at Fort Hamilton." Thaddeus said, his voice eerily calm. "Tell him Thaddeus Blackwell requires his old regiment. 20 men, armed, tonight." Henderson's eyebrows rose fractionally, the only sign of surprise he allowed himself. "Yes, sir. Anything else?" "Wake the staff. I want every lamp in the house lit, every door locked except the front entrance. And bring me my service revolver from the armory." "At once, sir." Henderson vanished. Thaddeus turned to Isolde, who stood frozen in the center of the study. "Listen to me," he said, crossing to her and gripping her shoulders, not roughly but firmly enough to anchor her spiraling thoughts. "They think they're hunting a rabbit. They're coming here expecting to find you a lone, frightened, easy prey. They have no idea they're walking into a wolf's den." "I can't fight them," Isolde whispered. "If they take me back, if they put me in that cellar again." "They won't." Thaddeus's gray eyes bored into hers. "Because you're not going to hide. You're going to stand beside me, and when they come through that door with their restraints and their lies, you're going to look them in the eye and tell them exactly what they are." "What if I can't?" "You can." He released her shoulders and walked to his desk, unlocking a drawer. When he turned back, he held a Colt Navy revolver. "Have you ever fired a gun?" Isolde shook her head. "Then tonight you learn." He pressed the weapon into her hands. It was heavier than she expected, cold steel warming slightly against her palms. 6 rounds, Thaddeus said, demonstrating. Hammer back. Aim. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull. The recoil will be significant, so brace yourself. You want me to shoot them? I want you to be ready to defend yourself. His voice was iron. If Mordaunt or any of his orderlies get past me, past my men, past every layer of defense I'm putting between you and them, then yes, you shoot. Center mass. Don't hesitate. Isolde looked down at the gun in her shaking hands. 3 years ago, she'd been a sheltered heiress who'd never touched a weapon in her life. Now she stood in a railroad baron's study learning to kill. I don't know if I can, she said honestly. You drowned for 2 minutes and survived, Thaddeus said. You can do this. By 2 in the morning, Blackwell Manor had transformed into a fortress. Colonel Isaiah Sterling arrived with 20 men veterans from Thaddeus's old unit, the 5th Connecticut Infantry Intelligence Division. They weren't in uniform, just dark wool coats and cold eyes that had seen Confederate prisons and Sherman's march, and things that made them understand exactly why their former major had summoned them in the middle of the night. Sterling himself was a bear of a man, with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow and hands that could crush walnuts. He clasped Thaddeus's arm in the entrance hall like a brother. Major, Sterling said, what do you need? Defensive positions. Thaddeus replied, already moving toward the study where he'd spread a hand-drawn map of the manor across his desk. They'll come through the front entrance, arrogant, believing they have the law on their side. I want them to walk into a killing field, metaphorically speaking. Sterling studied the map. How many hostiles? Unknown. At least Dr. Mordaunt and 4 orderlies from Riverside. Possibly Cornelius and Garrett Vance. They'll have restraints, possibly sedatives, definitely forged commitment papers. Rules of engagement. Non-lethal unless absolutely necessary. Thaddeus's finger traced the manor's layout. But I want them terrified. I want them to understand that they've made a catastrophic mistake. Sterling's scarred face split into a grim smile. We can arrange that. Within the hour, the manor was ready. Men positioned on the second-floor balcony overlooking the entrance hall, more hidden behind the heavy drapes flanking the stairs. 2 stationed in the dining room with clear sightlines to the foyer. Henderson himself stood ready near the door with a Remington shotgun, his own from the war lovingly maintained. Every lamp in the house blazed, not trying to hide, daring them to come. Isolde stood in the entrance hall beside Thaddeus, still wearing the midnight blue opera gown, the Blackwell Sapphire's cold fire at her throat. The Colt revolver was a reassuring weight in the hidden pocket of her skirt. How do you know they'll come tonight? She asked. Because Cornelius is desperate, Thaddeus said. Every hour you're free is another hour society whispers about what happened at the opera. Another hour his carefully constructed lies crumble. He needs to reclaim control immediately. As if summoned by the words, the sound of carriage wheels crunched on the gravel drive. Not 1 carriage, 2. Sterling raised his hand. 20 men went perfectly still, 20 rifles aimed, but held low, invisible in shadow. Isolde's heart hammered against her ribs. The sapphires felt like they were choking her. Thaddeus's hand found hers in the folds of her skirt. He squeezed once, then let go. The front door burst open. Cornelius Vance stormed in first, wearing a fur coat and righteous indignation like armor. Behind him limped Garrett, his right wrist splinted and bandaged from where Thaddeus had crushed the bones. Then came Dr. Silas Mordaunt, a thin, vulture-like man with wire spectacles and carrying a leather medical bag. And finally, 4 massive orderlies in the gray uniforms of Riverside Sanitarium, carrying leather restraints and canvas straitjackets. They stopped just inside the threshold, clearly expecting servants to cower, expecting Isolde to run. Instead, they found Thaddeus Blackwell standing alone at the base of the grand staircase, blocking the path to the upper floors. Isolde stood slightly behind him, chin raised, eyes hard. Good evening, Cornelius. Thaddeus said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. I don't recall sending an invitation. This is not a social call, Blackwell. Cornelius threw his gloves onto a side table with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. We're here for my niece. Dr. Mordaunt has certified that her condition has deteriorated dangerously. She's a threat to herself and others. Dr. Mordaunt stepped forward, waving a rolled parchment like a battle standard. I'm afraid it's true, Mr. Blackwell. The delusions, the violent outburst at the opera, Mrs. Vance requires immediate treatment in the isolation ward at Riverside. Her name, Thaddeus said coldly, is Mrs. Blackwell. Garrett sneered, cradling his injured wrist. Don't make this difficult, Blackwell. We have a magistrate's order. If you interfere with a court-mandated medical commitment, you'll be arrested for obstruction. Just hand her over. I promise I'll take personal care of her treatment. The casual cruelty in his voice, the implied ownership, the threat disguised as concern, made Isolde's hands curl into fists. Thaddeus didn't move, didn't blink. He looked at the group with the detached curiosity of an entomologist examining particularly unpleasant insects. You speak of the law, Thaddeus said calmly. Then let's discuss it. The Lunacy Act of 1845 requires specific procedures for involuntary commitment. Perhaps you're familiar with them, Dr. Mordaunt. Mordaunt's confident expression flickered. Of course, I'm a licensed physician. The act requires two separate medical certificates, Thaddeus continued, signed by two different physicians, after independent examinations conducted within 7 days of the commitment order. Tell me, doctor, when was the last time you physically examined Mrs. Blackwell? Mordaunt's Adam's apple bobbed. I made an assessment based on the Guardian's detailed report and her documented history of instability. This is standard practice in cases of chronic. That's fraud. Thaddeus cut in his voice like a whip crack. And it's a felony. 20 years in a state penitentiary. Cornelius's face purpled. This is preposterous. I have the papers. I have the legal authority. She is my ward until proven competent, and she is clearly insane. Is she? Thaddeus gestured to Isolde. She's standing here, calm, rational. Perhaps you'd like to specify exactly what symptoms of insanity you're observing. She attacked my son at the opera, Cornelius roared, caused a public scene, made wild accusations. I observed the incident, Thaddeus said. Your son attempted to touch my wife without her consent. I defended her. That's called marriage, not madness. Garrett took a step forward, his good hand twitching toward his coat pocket. Toward what, a weapon for more forged papers? Enough of this, Garrett snarled. We're not here to debate legal technicalities. The girl is sick, damaged. She belongs in Riverside where she can receive proper care. Men seize her. The four orderlies moved forward. Thaddeus raised his right hand. Click, 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 click. The sound was mechanical, synchronized, chilling. From the balcony above, from behind the curtains from the dining room doorway, 20 rifles leveled simultaneously. The metallic ratchet of hammers cocking echoed through the entrance hall like thunder. The orderlies froze mid-step. Colonel Sterling stepped out from behind a marble pillar, a Webley revolver in his hand aimed directly at Dr. Mordaunt's head. I suggest, Sterling said conversationally, that your men stop moving, unless they're eager to leave this house in pine boxes. The color drained from Cornelius's face. Dr. Mordaunt dropped his medical bag with a clatter. Garrett made a strangled sound and stumbled backward, his injured wrist forgotten. What is the meaning of this? Cornelius's voice came out strangled. This is treason. You cannot threaten citizens with military force. This is my home, Thaddeus said, his voice dropping to a register that promised violence. And you are trespassers. I am simply ensuring that the proceedings are conducted properly. With witnesses, with evidence, with justice. He walked slowly down the remaining stairs, boots clicking on marble until he stood face to face with Cornelius. You want to discuss the law? Let's discuss it. That parchment Dr. Mordaunt is waving, let me guess. A magistrate's signature? Perhaps Judge Morrison, the same judge who owes you $50,000 in gambling debts. Cornelius's eyes widened fractionally. Thaddeus smiled, thin, sharp, predatory. I had my investigators look into your finances, Cornelius. Fascinating reading. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, the shell companies, the systematic liquidation of the Vance Steel assets, the bribes, all of it. He pulled a thick leather portfolio from inside his jacket and let it fall at Cornelius's feet. Documents spilled across the marble bank ledgers, transfer records, affidavits. That's 4 years of embezzlement, $2.3 million stolen from your niece's inheritance. You didn't just imprison her to trigger the sanity clause. You murdered your brother to get control of the estate in the first place. That's a lie, Cornelius's voice cracked. Jonathan died of heart failure, natural causes. Digitalis poisoning, Thaddeus corrected, also known as foxglove. The autopsy report noted the symptoms, but didn't pursue the investigation because you paid the examiner to rule it natural causes. Unfortunately for you, tissue samples were preserved, and modern chemical analysis can detect digitalis even years later. He gestured to Sterling, who produced another document. That's a warrant for your arrest signed this afternoon by the New York District Attorney. Murder, fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit unlawful imprisonment. The room spun for Cornelius Vance. His carefully constructed world, the lies, the bribes, the shell companies, the facade of respectability, was crumbling brick by brick. This is impossible, Cornelius whispered. You have no proof, no witnesses. It's her word against mine, and she's insane. I am not your property, The voice rang out clear and strong. Isolde stepped forward, moving past Thaddeus to stand in the center of the entrance hall. Every eye in the room turned to her. The orderlies, the soldiers, Cornelius and Garrett, and Dr. Mordaunt. She looked at them each in turn, and there was no fear in her violet eyes, only cold, crystalline rage. "I am not a bird," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. "I am not broken. I am not insane. I was tortured. There is a difference." She turned to Garrett, who was trying to edge toward the door. "You broke my skin. You broke my bones. You held me underwater until I stopped breathing. But you never touched me. The part of me that survived, the part that remembered, the part that's been waiting for this moment for 3 years." Garrett's face had gone white as chalk. Isolde turned to her uncle. "You told the world I was mad because I grieved for my father. You told the staff at Riverside I was possessed because I refused to sign forged documents. You didn't lock me away to cure me, Uncle Cornelius. You locked me away because I was the only person who knew you murdered him. You lying little wretch." Cornelius lunged forward, hands outstretched, reaching for her throat. He made it 3 steps before Thaddeus's fist connected with his jaw. The sound was like a gunshot. Cornelius went down hard, crumpling to the marble floor in a heap of fur coat and broken dignity. The entrance hall erupted. Garrett tried to run for the door. Sterling's boot caught him in the ribs, dropping him. The orderlies raised their hands, surrendering immediately when 20 rifles aimed at their heads. Dr. Mordaunt stood frozen, calculating frantically, trying to find an escape route that didn't exist. Thaddeus stood over Cornelius's semi-conscious form, flexing his bruised knuckles. "Colonel," he said calmly, "secure them." Sterling's men moved with military efficiency. Within minutes, the orderlies were disarmed and seated against the wall, hands visible. Garrett was hauled to his feet, groaning. Cornelius was dragged to a chair, blood trickling from his split lip. Dr. Mordaunt remained standing, but trapped between 2 soldiers with very steady rifles. Thaddeus walked to his desk and returned with a fresh sheet of parchment and a fountain pen. "Dr. Mordaunt," he said pleasantly, "I have a medical question for you. In your professional opinion, does Cornelius Vance appear to be of sound mind?" Mordaunt's eyes darted between Cornelius and the guns and the evidence scattered across the floor. This is highly irregular." "Look at him," Thaddeus pressed, sweating profusely. "Irrational behavior. Just attempted to assault a woman in front of 20 witnesses, screaming about conspiracies. Would you say those are signs of mental stability?" The trap was exquisite. Mordaunt could see it closing around him like iron jaws. "I would need to conduct a proper examination." Thaddeus's voice hardened. "Let me be clear, Doctor. You have 2 choices. Choice 1, you admit that Cornelius Vance is exhibiting signs of acute mania and requires immediate institutionalization. You sign the commitment papers, and you walk out of here a free man, albeit a disgraced one." He paused. "Choice 2, you maintain that he's sane, which makes him a criminal guilty of murder, fraud, and conspiracy, and makes you his accomplice. 47 women tortured at Riverside, 47 counts of assault, medical malpractice, accepting in bribes. That's a death sentence, Doctor. Connecticut still hangs people." The color drained from Mordaunt's face. His hands trembled as he reached for the pen. This is coercion. This is justice," Isolde said quietly. Mordaunt looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, not as a patient, not as property, as a woman who had survived his torture and come back with an army. His hands shook as he signed the commitment papers. Cornelius realized what was happening. "No, Mordaunt, you bastard, don't you dare! I pay you, I own you." "The patient is delusional," Mordaunt said loudly, his voice gaining false confidence. "Claims to own people. Classic symptom of megalomania with paranoid features. Requires immediate isolation and restraint." "No!" Cornelius lurched from his chair, but Sterling's men forced him back down. "I'm not insane. This is a conspiracy. They're framing me. Someone, Garrett, do something." But Garrett wasn't listening. He'd seen his future in his father's eyes and wanted no part of it. He was already cooperating with the soldiers, giving up information, trying desperately to save himself. Thaddeus held out the commitment form to Isolde. "Final signature required," he said quietly. "Guardian's authorization." Isolde took the pen. Her hand was steady as she signed her name in clear, firm letters. Isolde Vance Blackwell. She looked down at her uncle and her voice was ice. "Enjoy Riverside, Uncle. I made sure they know you're coming. I told them to prepare the isolation ward, the cellar cell, the one with no windows, the one where sound doesn't carry. I told them to use the same ice baths you approved for me. 4 hours. Every day, for as long as you live. Cornelius's face crumpled. He began to sob great heaving sounds that echoed off the marble. Please, he begged. Isolde, please. I'm your blood. I'm your family. My family is dead, Isolde said. You killed them. She turned away as Sterling's men hauled Cornelius to his feet and dragged him toward the waiting carriage, the same black carriage with barred windows that he'd brought to collect her. The poetic justice was not lost on anyone present. Dr. Mordaunt was escorted out next, already calculating which countries didn't have extradition treaties. Garrett followed, still clutching his broken wrist, his future dissolving into a blur of legal proceedings and disgrace. The orderlies were last looking relieved to have escaped with their lives. And then the entrance hall was empty except for Isolde and Thaddeus and the 20 silent soldiers who'd witnessed everything. Colonel Sterling approached, holstering his revolver. Major, he said quietly, we'll keep watch until dawn. Make sure no one else tries anything foolish. Thaddeus nodded. Thank you, Isaiah. I owe you. You saved my life at Cold Harbor. We're even. Sterling's scarred face softened slightly as he looked at Isolde. Ma'am, you did well tonight. Real well. Then he and his men melted back into the shadows, leaving Isolde and Thaddeus alone in the blazing lamplight. The adrenaline was draining from Isolde's body, leaving her shaking. Her knees buckled. Thaddeus caught her before she could fall, pulling her against his chest. I did it, she whispered into his shirt. I really did it. You stood tall, Thaddeus murmured, his chin resting on top of her head. You were magnificent. She pulled back to look at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed but bright. What happens now? Now, Thaddeus's mouth curved into something that might actually be a smile. Now we finish what we started. Tomorrow we file charges. We expose everything. We make sure no other woman suffers what you suffered. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. And then, Isolde Blackwell, you're going to help me burn their world to the ground. Outside, the first hints of dawn were touching the eastern sky. The long night was ending, but the real fight was just beginning. 3 weeks passed like water through a sieve, fast, relentless, carrying away everything Cornelius Vance had built on lies. The New York Tribune broke the story first. Not on page 6 with the society gossip, but front page above the fold in bold type that screamed across every breakfast table from Fifth Avenue to the Bowery steel heiress tortured in asylum while Uncle stole millions. By noon, every newspaper in the city had picked it up. By evening, the scandal had reached Boston, Philadelphia, Washington. By week's end, the entire Eastern Seaboard knew the name Isolde Blackwell and what had been done to her. The New York District Attorney moved with unusual speed. When $4 million and a murdered industrialist were involved, even Tammany Hall's corruption had its limits. The grand jury convened. Witnesses were called. Evidence was presented. And on a cold February morning, Isolde stood in the witness box of the New York State Supreme Court, facing a packed gallery of journalists, socialites, and the merely curious who'd queued since dawn for a seat. She wore a high-necked dress of charcoal gray. No jewelry except her wedding ring. Hair pulled back severely. She looked like what she was, a woman who had survived hell and refused to be ashamed of it. The prosecutor, a sharp-featured man named Aldrich, approached the stand. Mrs. Blackwell, he began gently, I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell the court, in your own words, what happened at Riverside Sanitarium. Isolde's hands gripped the wooden rail of the witness box. In the front row, Thaddeus sat perfectly still, his gray eyes locked on hers, lending her his strength just as he'd promised. I won't describe it, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom. I'll show it. Before anyone could object, before Aldrich could ask what she meant, Isolde reached up and unbuttoned her collar. The courtroom inhaled as one. She turned her back to the gallery, pulled the dress down to her waist, and let them see. The scars gleamed pale and terrible in the winter sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Whip marks crisscrossed her shoulders like the rails of a prison. Circular burns spotted her shoulder blades. One particularly vicious scar ran from her left shoulder down to her spine, the place where Matron Howell had used the cane with extra vigor for the crime of speaking her father's name. 2 women in the gallery fainted. A man cursed and had to be escorted out by bailiffs. The jury, 12 men who thought they'd seen everything in this city, went pale. Even the judge, a hard-bitten veteran of 20 years on the bench, looked away. Isolde pulled her dress back up and turned to face them. Her eyes were unflinching. 3 years, she said into the ringing silence. 3 years of what they called treatment. Ice baths until hypothermia set in. Whippings when I mentioned my father's name. Burnings when I refused to sign documents that I knew were forged. She pointed to the defense table where Dr. Silas Mordaunt sat in shackles, his vulture face impassive. That man told me the pain was God's mercy, that my suffering would purify my possessed soul, that if I screamed it only proved the demons were fighting to stay inside me. Her finger moved to the second defendant's table. Garrett Vance, his wrist still splinted, wouldn't meet her eyes. That man my own cousin visited every Sunday. He watched through observation windows. Sometimes Dr. Mordaunt let him participate in the ice bath treatments. He would hold me underwater and count. 1, 2, 3, seeing how long I could last before I stopped struggling. Isolde's voice dropped, became conversational. Somehow that made it worse. The longest I lasted was 2 minutes and 17 seconds. I know because he timed it with his pocket watch. He was very proud. He told the orderlies I had remarkable lung capacity for a woman. Garrett made a strangled sound. The judge's gavel came down hard. Order. Isolde turned to the third table. It was empty. Cornelius Vance was not present, could not be present. He was currently a patient at Riverside Sanitarium in the isolation ward, where he'd spent the past 3 weeks screaming about ghosts and conspiracies until his voice gave out. My uncle murdered my father with digitalis poison, Isolde said flatly. He forged my father's will. He had me declared insane and imprisoned so he could steal my inheritance. $4 million. That was the price of 3 years of torture. That was what my pain was worth to him. She looked directly at the jury. Gentlemen, I don't want your pity. I want your justice. These men destroyed 47 women's lives. They profited from suffering. They hid behind medicine and law and respectability while they committed atrocities. And they would still be doing it if I hadn't escaped. If my husband hadn't believed me. If we hadn't fought back. She paused. I'm not the only victim here, but I'm the only one who survived with enough money and power to make them pay. So I'm asking you no, I'm demanding that you hold them accountable. Not just for me, for all of us. The courtroom erupted. The judge's gavel came down again and again calling for order, but the damage was done. The image was seared into every mind present, this small scarred woman standing in the witness box, shoulders back, chin high, demanding justice instead of begging for it. Aldrich had no further questions. The defense attorney, a nervous man who'd taken Mordaunt's case only because the fee was substantial, wisely chose not to cross-examine. The trial continued for another week. Forensic evidence was presented: tissue samples from Jonathan Vance's preserved organs showing digitalis, bank records proving embezzlement, testimony from other Riverside patients, women who'd survived and found the courage to speak because Isolde had spoken first. Henderson took the stand and told the story of his daughter Sarah, who'd been sent to Riverside for the crime of leaving her abusive husband, who'd come home broken and taken her own life 3 months later. His voice never wavered, but tears ran down his weathered face. Thaddeus presented the forged documents, the bribed officials of the shell companies. He laid out the conspiracy with the precision of a military intelligence officer, which was exactly what he'd been. No detail too small, no connection too tenuous. The web of corruption was vast, and he'd mapped every strand. The defense tried to argue temporary insanity for Garrett, tried to claim Dr. Mordaunt was simply following accepted medical practices of the time, tried to suggest that Isolde herself was unreliable, unstable, possibly still suffering from the delusions that had led to her original commitment. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and faced the judge. In the matter of the state versus Cornelius Vance on the charge of first-degree murder, how do you find guilty? On the charge of fraud and embezzlement, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit unlawful imprisonment, guilty on all counts. The verdicts for Garrett and Dr. Mordaunt followed. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The words fell like hammer blows. The judge removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with disgust. Cornelius Vance, you are sentenced to death by hanging. Due to your current mental incapacity, the sentence will be carried out when and if you are deemed competent to understand your punishment. Until that time, you will remain confined at the state asylum at Ward's Island. He turned to Garrett. Garrett Vance, you are sentenced to 20 years hard labor at Sing Sing prison. And finally to Dr. Mordaunt. Dr. Silas Mordaunt, you are sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Additionally, your medical license is permanently revoked, and I am recommending to the state legislature that they investigate conditions at all private asylums in New York. The gavel came down one final time. This court is adjourned. Isolde walked down the courthouse steps into a wall of flashbulb powder and shouted questions. Journalists swarmed like locusts, pushing forward, desperate for a quote, a reaction, anything they could print. Mrs. Blackwell, how do you feel about the verdict? Will you be pressing charges against other Riverside staff? What message do you have for other women in similar situations? Thaddeus's hand was at the small of her back, guiding her through the chaos. Colonel Sterling and four of his men formed a protective cordon, pushing back the more aggressive reporters. But Isolde stopped at the bottom of the steps. She turned to face them. The questions died. Pencils poised over notebooks. The moment stretched. I have nothing to say to the press, Isolde said clearly, but I have something to say to the women who are still trapped. She looked directly into the camera of the man from the Tribune who'd broken the story. You are not insane. You are not possessed. You are not defective. You are prisoners. And what was done to me can be done to any of you, as long as the laws allow men to imprison their wives, their daughters, their sisters, without trial or evidence or justice. Her voice strengthened. So I am announcing the creation of the Vance Foundation for Women's Rights. We will provide legal representation for any woman seeking release from unlawful commitment. We will investigate abuses, we will lobby for legislative reform, and we will not stop until every woman in every asylum in this country has the right to defend herself in court. She paused. My uncle stole $4 million from me. I'm using every penny of it to make sure no one can do to another woman what he did to me. The cameras flashed like lightning. The questions erupted again, but Isolde was done. She let Thaddeus guide her to the waiting carriage and they disappeared into the New York traffic. 2 months later, on the first truly warm day of spring, Isolde stood in an empty field in Westchester County, watching smoke rise from the ruins of Riverside Sanitarium. The building had been officially closed 3 weeks earlier. The state had revoked its license. The remaining patients had been transferred to proper hospitals or released to family members who'd been searching for them for years. And this morning, with the permission of the county and a team of demolition experts, Isolde had lit the first stick of dynamite herself. The explosion had been spectacular, satisfying, final. Now the building was rubble and ash, and Isolde felt something in her chest that she hadn't felt in 3 years. Peace. It's done, Thaddeus said quietly, standing beside her. Are you satisfied? Isolde thought about that. Satisfaction seemed too small a word for what she felt watching the place of her torture reduced to smoking debris. Not satisfied, she said finally, but it's a start. She turned to face the group assembled behind them. Henderson, who'd driven them up from the city, Colonel Sterling, who'd brought a bottle of bourbon to toast the occasion, Catherine Delacroix, the Tribune journalist, who'd covered the trial and become an unexpected ally, and 43 women, former Riverside patients who'd survived and come to witness this moment. Some were crying, some were laughing, some just stood in silence staring at the ruins. One of them, a young woman named Marie, who'd been committed by her husband for the crime of reading too many books, approached Isolde hesitantly. Thank you, Marie whispered. I never thought I didn't believe I'd ever be free. You're free now, Isolde said. What will you do with it? Marie's smile was fierce. I'm going to law school. I'm going to become a lawyer. And I'm going to sue my husband for every penny he has. Good, Isolde said. The foundation will pay your tuition. All of it. Marie's eyes widened. Before she could respond, another woman approached. Then another. Within minutes, Isolde was surrounded by survivors, all of them, talking at once, sharing plans, dreams, futures they'd thought were lost forever. Thaddeus watched from a respectful distance, his expression unreadable. Catherine Delacroix joined him, notebook conspicuously absent for once. You know what you've done, don't you? Catherine said quietly. Destroyed a building, started a revolution. Catherine nodded toward the women. The Ashford-Whitmore Mental Health Reform Act is going to the Senate next month. It's going to pass. Because of her testimony. Because she refused to be silent. She was never silent, Thaddeus said. They just wouldn't listen. And now the whole country is listening. Catherine was quiet for a moment, watching Isolde laugh at something one of the women said. She looked different now. Lighter. The shadows that had haunted her eyes since the trial were finally fading. What about you, Mr. Blackwell? Catherine asked. You got your timberland. You got a wife who's become a national figure. What did you expect when you married her? Thaddeus's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile. I expected 50,000 acres of trees, he said. What I got was a forest fire. He paused. Best investment I ever made. The carriage ride back to Blackwell Manor was quiet, peaceful. Isolde sat across from Thaddeus, watching the spring countryside roll past the windows. The trees were budding, the fields turning green, the world waking up after a long, brutal winter. The Senate hearing is in 3 weeks, Isolde said. Senator Morrison wants me to testify again. In Washington. Will you go to? Yes. She looked at him. Will you come with me? Always. It was such a simple word, but coming from Thaddeus Blackwell, the Ice King who'd spent 32 years building walls around himself, it meant everything. I've been thinking, Isolde said slowly, about what comes after the law passes, after the foundation is running, after all the immediate work is done. And she reached across the carriage and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers automatically warmly. I want a life, she said. Not just a crusade. I want mornings drinking coffee, evenings reading by the fire. I want to learn to ride a horse, plant a garden, maybe have children someday if... She stopped. The fear was still there lurking. The fear that she was too damaged, too broken, that 3 years in hell had ruined her for normal happiness. If what? Thaddeus prompted gently. If I can be a good mother. After everything that was done to me. After everything I've seen. What if I'm too... Stop. Thaddeus pulled her across the carriage to sit beside him. His arm went around her shoulders. You survived 3 years of systematic torture. You stood up in court and demanded justice. You're building a foundation that will save hundreds of women. If you can do all that, you can do anything. He tilted her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. And you're not broken, Isolde. You're forged. There's a difference. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but they were good tears, healing tears. I love you, she whispered. It was the first time she'd said it aloud. Thaddeus's expression softened in a way she'd never seen before, the ice finally fully melting. I love you too, he said. My forest fire, my revolution, my wife. He kissed her, then soft and careful and full of promise. Not duty, not obligation, choice. When they arrived at Blackwell Manor, the sun was setting, painting the stone facade golden rose. Henderson met them at the door with his usual efficiency, but there was something in his face, something lighter. Welcome home, sir. Madam, he said, and the word home sounded different now. Real. Inside the house had changed. Isolde had spent the past 2 months slowly transforming it from the Ice King's fortress into something warmer, softer. Books replaced cold formality in the library. Fresh flowers appeared on tables. The curtains stayed open, letting in light. The manor was becoming a home. That evening, they sat together in the study, the same room where Thaddeus had shown her the truth about her father's will, where she'd learned to pick locks, where the plan for revenge had been born. But tonight, there were no files spread across the desk, no maps of conspiracy, no weapons being cleaned, just 2 people sitting by the fire reading in comfortable silence. Isolde looked up from her book and found Thaddeus watching her. What? She asked, smiling. Nothing, just thinking. About what? About how I married you for Timberland and got so much more. Isolde set down her book and moved to sit beside him on the sofa. She curled against his side, his arm automatically coming around her. Do you regret it? She asked quietly. Your life was simpler before. Quieter. Quieter, yes. Simpler, no. Thaddeus pressed a kiss to the top of her head. I was frozen, Isolde, going through the motions, building railroads and making money and not really living. You set me on fire. You made me feel again. Made me fight again. Made me remember why I survived the war so I could do something that mattered. And the timberland. Sold it last week. Isolde sat up startled. What? Sold it to the state of Maine for a conservation preserve. Used the money to endow the foundation. He smiled at her, shocked expression. What did you think I actually cared about trees? I cared about you. Everything else was just details. Isolde laughed, a real full laugh that echoed off the study's high ceiling. It sounded strange to her own ears. How long since she'd laughed like that? Years. Maybe forever. You're ridiculous, she said. I'm practical. The foundation needed funding. The timberland was worth $2 million. Simple economics. You're impossible. You're beautiful. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, night had fallen completely. The manor was quiet except for the distant sounds of Henderson locking up the grandfather clock in the hall, ticking away seconds the wind in the bare branches outside. Thaddeus, Isolde said eventually. Thank you for believing me, for fighting with me, for giving me the strength to fight back. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. You had the strength all along, Isolde. I just made sure you had the weapons. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning, Isolde stood in the Senate gallery in Washington, D.C., watching the vote tally appear on the board. The Ashford-Whitmore Mental Health Reform Act, requiring independent medical examination, legal representation, and criminal penalties for asylum abuse, passed 52 to 23. The gallery erupted in applause. Women who traveled from across the country to witness this moment wept openly. Catherine Delacroix scribbled furiously in her notebook, and beside Isolde, Thaddeus stood with his hand clasped firmly in hers. "We did it," Isolde whispered. "You did it," Thaddeus corrected. That evening, there was a reception at the Willard Hotel. Senators and congressmen and reformers and journalists all crowded into the ballroom to celebrate the victory. Isolde moved through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, feeling simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. But eventually she slipped away to the terrace, needing air, needing quiet. The Washington night was cool and clear, stars visible despite the city lights. Isolde leaned against the stone balustrade and looked out at the Capitol, thinking about how far she'd come. A year ago, she'd been a prisoner, silent, broken, convinced she would die in that cellar. Now she was standing in the nation's capital, having just changed federal law. Footsteps behind her, she turned to find Thaddeus silhouetted in the doorway holding 2 glasses of champagne. "Hiding from your admirers?" he asked, handing her a glass. Catching my breath, she accepted the champagne and took a sip. "It's a lot, all of this. Sometimes I still can't believe it's real." "It's real," Thaddeus joined her at the balustrade. "You're real, the law is real. The lives you've saved are real." Isolde was quiet for a moment, then said, "Cornelius died last week." Thaddeus nodded. He'd received the telegram, but hadn't mentioned it, waiting for her to bring it up if she wanted to. "How do you feel about that?" he asked. "I don't know," Isolde admitted. "Part of me wanted him to live long enough to be executed, to face justice consciously. But another part is just glad he's gone, that he can't hurt anyone ever again." She turned to face Thaddeus. "Does that make me a bad person? That I'm not sorry he's dead?" "It makes you human." Thaddeus set down his glass and took both her hands in his. "He tortured you. He killed your father. He stole years of your life. You're allowed to be glad he's gone. You're allowed to celebrate that he died alone and afraid in the same institution where he sent you to die." Poetic justice. The best kind. Isolde leaned into him, and his arms came around her automatically. They stood like that for a long time, watching the stars, feeling the future stretch out before them, vast and uncertain and full of possibility. "What do we do now?" Isolde asked eventually. "Now." Thaddeus pulled back to look at her. "Now we go home. Back to Connecticut. Back to our life. And you decide what you want that life to look like. Foundation work, lobbying, testimony, whatever you choose. And if I choose to just live to have quiet mornings and peaceful evenings and maybe a garden, then we'll plant the best damn garden in New England." Isolde laughed. "And children? As many as you want, or none if you'd prefer. It's your choice, Isolde. It's always your choice." She looked up at him, this man who'd married her for trees and stayed for her. This ice king who'd melted into something warm and vital and real. "I choose us," she said softly. "I choose a life where we fight when we need to and rest when we can. Where we build something good from all this darkness. Where we remember what was done, but don't let it define us. I like that choice. And I choose you, every day. Not because I have to, because I want to." Thaddeus kissed her, then gentle and sure, and in that kiss was everything they'd survived, and everything they'd built, and everything they would become. When they finally pulled apart, Isolde rested her forehead against his. "Take me home," she whispered. "Always." Spring came to Blackwell Manor with fury and beauty. The gardens that Isolde had planted the previous fall burst into a riotous color. Tulips and daffodils and hyacinths crowded the beds. Cherry trees exploded in pink blossoms. The world that had been frozen and dead was alive again. On a warm May morning, Isolde stood in the garden dirt under her fingernails, sun on her face, planting tomatoes with fierce concentration. Her hair had grown long again, pulled back in a simple braid. She wore a plain cotton dress, practical and comfortable. She looked nothing like the silent lady who'd arrived at this house 16 months ago. She looked free. Henderson approached from the house, carrying a telegram on a silver tray. "Madam," he said, "this just arrived from New York." Isolde straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. She opened the telegram and read it quickly. Her face broke into a wide smile. "What is it?" Thaddeus called from where he was supposedly supervising the construction of a new trellis, but was mostly just watching his wife garden with an expression that could only be described as besotted. "The last patient was released from Ward's Island Asylum this morning," Isolde said, waving the telegram. "That's 47 facilities shut down or reformed in the past year." 47. She looked at the paper in her hand, then at the garden around her, then at Thaddeus. "We did it. We actually did it." Thaddeus crossed the garden and pulled her into his arms, not caring about the dirt. You did it, he corrected. I just provided the army. We did it together. A small sound from the house made them both turn. In the doorway, Henderson stood holding a bundle of blankets. From within came the unmistakable cry of a newborn. I believe Miss Sarah is awake and demanding attention, Henderson said with the closest thing to a smile Isolde had ever seen on his weathered face. Isolde hurried inside and took her 3-month-old daughter from Henderson's arms. Sarah named for Henderson's daughter, who had died at Riverside, for all the daughters who'd been lost, for all the women who hadn't survived, had Thaddeus's gray eyes and Isolde's determination evident even at this young age. Thaddeus joined them, looking down at his daughter with an expression of wonder that still surprised him every time. She's going to be trouble, he said. She's going to be magnificent, Isolde corrected. They stood together in the doorway of Blackwell Manor, the house that had been a fortress and become a home, the place where a cold marriage of convenience had transformed into something real and vital and true. You know what I realized, Isolde said, rocking Sarah gently. What? They tried to make me silent, to break me, to erase me, and instead they made me into exactly what they feared most. What's that? Isolde looked at her husband, her daughter, her home, at the garden blooming, at the future stretching out before them. A woman who refuses to be quiet, a woman who fights back, a woman who burns down their world and builds something better from the ashes. She smiled. They tried to destroy me, and instead they forged me into something they could never control. Thaddeus kissed her temple. My forest fire, he murmured. My revolution. My love. And as the sun climbed higher over Blackwell Manor, painting everything in gold, Isolde felt something she'd never thought she'd feel again. Not just survival, not just justice, but joy. Pure, uncomplicated, hard-won joy. 2 weeks later, on a perfect June morning, Isolde and Thaddeus made a quiet journey to a small cemetery in upstate New York. Jonathan Vance's grave sat beneath an old oak tree, the headstone weathered but still legible. Isolde knelt before it, baby Sarah asleep in her arms, and placed a bouquet of white roses on the grass. Hello, Father, she said softly. I'm sorry it took so long to come. Thaddeus stood a respectful distance back, giving her space. Uncle Cornelius is gone. The asylum is destroyed. The women he hurt are free. The laws are changing. Isolde's voice was steady, though tears slipped down her cheeks. I know you'd be proud, not of the revenge, but of what came after. The reform, the foundation, the lives we've saved. She touched the headstone with her free hand. I brought someone to meet you. She looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms. This is Sarah, your granddaughter. She has your stubbornness, I think. And she's going to grow up in a world that's a little bit better because of what you tried to give me. Because of what you actually did give me the strength to survive. The will to fight back. Isolde stood slowly. I'm free now, Father. Finally, truly free. Not just from the cellar, from all of it. The fear, the shame, the silence. She turned to Thaddeus, who stepped forward and placed his hand on her shoulder. And I'm not alone anymore. They stood there for a long moment, the three of them, Isolde, Thaddeus, and baby Sarah, in the dappled shade beneath the oak tree. A family. Not the one Isolde had lost, but the one she'd built from the ashes. Finally, Isolde stepped back. Goodbye, Father. Rest easy. I've got it from here. As they walked back to the carriage, Thaddeus took her hand. Are you all right? He asked quietly. Isolde looked back one last time at her father's grave, at the white roses bright against the grass, at the oak tree standing sentinel. Yes, she said, and mean it. I really am. That evening back at Blackwell Manor, Isolde sat at Thaddeus's desk in the study, her desk now really, since she spent more time there than he did managing the Foundation's growing operations. She was reviewing applications for the Foundation's new legal scholarship program when Thaddeus entered with 2 glasses of wine. You should rest, he said, handing her one. You've been working since dawn. So have you. Yes, but I didn't give birth 3 months ago. Isolde smiled and accepted the wine. She set down her pen and leaned back in the chair, looking around the study. This room that had once felt like a war room now felt like a workshop, a place where they built things instead of just planning destruction. Do you ever think about what would have happened if your investigators hadn't found the real Will? She asked. If you'd married me without knowing about Riverside? Thaddeus considered this, settling into the chair across from her, the same chair where she'd first sat terrified and scarred while he'd explained about her father's fortune. I'd like to think I would have figured it out eventually, he said. The scars alone would have demanded investigation. But honestly, I don't know. The will gave me the weapon I needed. Without it, he shook his head. We might still have won, but it would have been harder, longer, more uncertain. Luck then. Preparation meeting opportunity. Thaddeus took a sip of wine. I've learned that most luck is just being ready when the moment comes. I was ready because I'd spent months investigating. You were ready because you'd spent 3 years surviving. When the moment came, we both knew what to do. Isolde thought about that, about how many things had to align perfectly for them to be sitting here now, safe and free and together. I used to think I was cursed, she said quietly. That gate or fate or whatever force governs the universe had singled me out for suffering. But now, now I think maybe I was being prepared. For this, for all of it. The foundation, the reform work, Sarah. She looked at him. You. Thaddeus stood and crossed to her. He pulled her to her feet and into his arms. I don't believe in fate, he said, but I believe in you, in us, in what we've built together. Even though we started with a lie, a transaction. Especially because we started there. His arms tightened around her. Anyone can build a marriage on romance and passion. Those burn out. What we have, what we forged in fire and blood and justice, that's permanent. Unbreakable. Isolde rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. I never thanked you properly, she murmured, for choosing to fight. You could have just taken the timberland and left me to my fate. Most men would have. I'm not most men. No, you're not. They stood like that for a long time in the study where their war had been planned and their partnership had been forged. Outside, the summer evening faded into night. Inside, the lamps cast warm shadows on the walls. Finally, Isolde pulled back. Come to bed, she said. Tomorrow we have work to do. What work? Marie's court date is next week, her divorce from that bastard husband. I want to be there when she wins. Thaddeus smiled. Then we'll be there. He extinguished the lamps one by one as they left the study, Isolde's hand in his. Behind them on the desk lay the Foundation's work scholarship applications from women who wanted to become lawyers, doctors, reformers. Investigation reports on other asylums. Letters from women still trapped begging for help. Letters from women freed sharing their gratitude and their plans. The work would never be finished. There would always be more women to save more laws to change more battles to fight. But tonight, Isolde and Thaddeus Blackwell climbed the stairs to their bedroom, not his bedroom or her bedroom, but theirs, and closed the door on the world. Tonight, they were just a husband and wife who'd found each other in the darkness and built something luminous from the ruins. Tomorrow, they would change the world again. But tonight, they rested. Together. And that was enough.